Welcome to episode 5 of Women in Finance. Thank you so much for tuning in and watching. And of course, liking and subscribing on our YouTube page. We really appreciate those comments coming through, especially when it comes to some of the previous guests that we've had on the series. My next guest is someone that I've known probably since 2012 when I started in broadcasting as a financial journalist. Her name is Annabel Bishop, and she is the Chief Economist at Investec. Annabel, thank you so much for making time to chat to me.
Sure, it's a pleasure.
So a lot of people see you on TV and they hear you on radio, and I'm sure people have been curious about how did you get here? So perhaps you can share your story about how you've navigated the industry and became the Chief Economist at Investec.
Sure, yes. Well, I suppose, it doesn't happen straight away. When I left university, I actually worked at a bank called McCarthy Bank. I worked there for a couple of years. It actually was taken out essentially by the basically another type of financial crisis, one we had in 1998. And of course, that obviously caused very, very high interest rates, caused a lot of pain in financial markets. But it was, a good experience for a couple of years. And then after that, I went to Econometrix in Johannesburg. And I think it's a wonderful organization to sort of get your grounding in. It's a very economics-focused organization, not actually financial services, but obviously, financial markets. So that was, a very interesting period of my life. And then in 2001, I came to Investec, and of course, obviously, didn't start off as a chief economist, and instead, continued to build my knowledge, continued to build my career, and certainly, focused a lot on econometric modeling, which obviously I was doing at Econometrix as well, and studied in my degree, and then, sort of moved through the ranks and eventually became the chief economist at Investec.
All right. So, when you were younger, was finance a career that you thought you would pursue? Like, what were the career options for you?
When I was very young, I actually wanted to be a teacher. I've always really wanted to be a primary school teacher, so that was very interesting to me. I think I particularly liked natural science, but I think as I went through high school, you start to, well, when I was at school, certainly economics was in geography, so we started to do geography and learn to know more about economics. So I quite enjoyed that, but I was still quite open-minded when I went to university. I wasn't set on exactly what I was going to do. I certainly did a BCom, and I think during the BCom, I discovered a love of economics.
Okay, so now we're going to talk about the BCom. What kind of student were you at varsity? Were you like an A student, or how would you describe yourself?
Sure. I think I was a try very hard student, but I don't think you can always get an A. But by the time I got to my master's degree, I got a cum laude, which is, an A student. So I think it took me a while to sort of settle at varsity and find my feet, find the subjects I liked. But, I managed to be successful by the end of it.
Navigating, I think, a career, and I think when I look at some of the stories the women have shared in previous episodes, and even my career, it hasn't always been smooth sailing, especially when people see the final product and they think you just woke up one day and became the chief economist. What would you say were some of the challenges, navigating through your career, etc.?
I think some of the challenges actually have been overwork, having too much on my plate, not getting to all the commitments I'd like to get to. That obviously creates difficulties because you feel like you're not perhaps doing everything you need to do, or perhaps you lose out on certain opportunities. So for me, I have always found that my days are extremely full, extremely busy, and certainly working through a corporate environment as well, there's the usual hurdles you face. I think when I first started Investec, I remember going to some meetings and finding myself the only woman in the room. And, that certainly changed now. But remember, I was, right at the start of the 2000s. And, I think just sort of finding your feet and growing your confidence has actually been quite important as well.
How do you manage to be clear about your career expectations as you move up in terms of, making the decision to go from McCarthy Bank to Econometrix to Investec? What informed you to say, I'm going to take this job offer, or I'm going to pursue this opportunity? Like, how did you become clear with that?
I think it was quality organizations, and also, of course, as well, meeting the people, having interviews, finding out the organizations. When I actually was going to come to Investec, I had another choice as well, to work at a research house, and I enjoyed the interview I had at Investec. I enjoyed the people I met, and I thought I would be comfortable at Investec. So that is actually why I chose it.
What if someone had to ask you what your daily or sort of day to day is like? Like, what does an economist actually do? Like, if someone said, well, now that I've gotten my economics degree, or that I'm studying towards economics, what will I be doing in the actual real world? How would you maybe give us a sense of what your day is like?
Well, first of all, I'd say there's a lot of reading. So if you're not a fan of reading, then it might not be the career for you. You need to read extensively, and you need to be able to read extremely quickly, but you also need to be able to condense information as well. So certainly reading is extremely important. I would also say as well that you need to be able to speak in public. You know, if you're a shy person and would not be able to do public speaking, then it's probably not the career for you. You don't want to find yourself under pressure every day where you feel, absolutely overwhelmed, and perhaps you never get past it, because that also includes TV interviews, radio interviews, as well as, large scale presentations, just pretty much being able to deal with anyone. So I think, a lot of people perhaps might prefer a quieter type of environment, an environment where they don't have to put themselves out there so much.
I mean, if when you look back at your career over the years, did you have mentors along the way, or people who you could give a call to sort of run past an idea, or who would advise you along the way?
I think when I started off at McCarthy Bank, there wasn't really another economist. So, the skills I gained there would have been more market related. I did certainly write economic reports as well, but it was a much smaller role, obviously, than the one I play now. It was a tiny little bank. It wasn't a chief economist role, but it was certainly an economist role. And, it was great to be in a banking environment, and everyone, obviously would be very helpful, would share their knowledge when needed. But again, it wasn't an economics environment. And I think when I went to Econometrix, there certainly were a lot of economists there. There was a wonderful man called Michael Bester who spent a lot of time, mentoring me and really just showing me the ropes, showing me what he would really like me to deliver at Econometrix. I think we also had Tony Twine when I was there, Azar Jameen, and, all of those well-known economists at the time. Remember I was there sort of in the late 90s, early 2000s. It was a huge benefit to learn from them and be part of their environment. At Investec, there wasn't really a chief economist when I joined. The economists, I think there's a bit of a changeover going on, but there were certainly some people who had been in the role who were very instrumental in guiding me in what they wanted from me, what they wanted me to deliver. But of course now, there's not that many. I mean, we did have Stephen Kossoff at Investec. He obviously was a great person to learn from and deal with as well. I still come into contact with him sometimes. And of course, that's very good for your confidence as well, to have, someone who believes in you, someone who trusts you, and someone who certainly promotes your work and definitely appreciates and values you. And I think that's something that's very important in a mentor as well.
Let's speak about that. I mean, I'm sure you've read, so many gender reports or discussions where people talk about empowering women or supporting young people, whether it's mentorship, etc. How do we go about doing that? Because sometimes you find that people are still stuck on the sort of structured idea of what a mentor relationship should be, where it's sort of rigid and there's a schedule behind it. But how do we rethink it at a corporate level to support our young people?
Look, I certainly think that rigidity is probably not helpful. I think actually getting to know the person, finding out their strengths, and certainly, building their confidence and building their areas of expertise, areas of knowledge, and being quite clear in sending a consistent message. I would say that's really important. From a mentor, someone that you might have had giving you some guidance, or someone you might have worked for several years. If they change the narrative, if they change the requirements, it's not clear. that can be a difficult hurdle to overcome if you're not really following exactly what they require from you. Particularly, I think also as well, for people to deal with many different aspects and areas, in their job, in their work, in their role, that can be a bit daunting as well. And I think, certainly for myself in a group role, I get a lot of requests from people across the entire group of Investec. Some of them conflict, some of them make it difficult because they're so large to deal with other requests. So I think, just having guidance in those matters as well as you're learning and growing through the ropes is also very important as well. I do think that if you do take on a chief economist role, it's something to bear in mind. It's not going to be the same as perhaps an economist role or, more of a singular research role. There's a lot more pressure. You find yourself being pulled apart by many different people, many different requirements. So, it's a lot about time management as well and workflow processes.
How have you dealt with that pressure? Because I can imagine, there's a lot that happens at Investec, and you send out lots of reports, and I can imagine how busy you become. But how do you deal with that day-to-day pressure where everybody wants something from you?
I think it's very important to prioritize. I think it's also very important to keep on your work, keep up on it. I don't like to leave anything ready for the next day or the next few days, unless, of course, it's unavoidable and I'm waiting for information or I'm waiting for input, or, it just would be better to do the work the next day for other reasons. And, that certainly helps you keep on top of it. Luckily, I am quite a fast and quick worker, which I think anyone will be when they have been practicing a role for a certain length of time. And I think it's just important as well to be very focused on your work. You can't really go into a role like this on a half-hearted basis.
Right.
You need to be very committed.
You mentioned in the early days of Investec, you had to get used to being the only woman in some meetings. Was it daunting raising your voice or sharing an opinion? Were you nervous at any point?
I think, sometimes you do feel a bit nervous. I think if the meeting's acrimonious, if you're battling to get your opinion across, I think I've learned that when I get shouted down or talked over, by a group of men, you wait for a gap and you try again. I think things have improved in Investec over the years. I would say that there's less of that now than there was at any company. I don't think it's anything particular to Investec. But I do think that, sometimes men can fall into the trap of being in a boys' club together, getting excited in meetings, talking and shouting. And then, for a lone woman or even for a couple of women, it's a bit difficult to get your voice in or to be heard.
And how easy, I think a lot of us have this idea of what banks sort of do, or the environment behind it. And we assume that it's like a boys' club and it's very hard as a female to break into the circle or to navigate, or you almost have to change your personality to be sort of a masculine energy and less sensitive. How do you balance being professional, doing your job, and meeting your deadlines with also the fact that you could be sensitive and certain things you approach differently from others? How do you balance that in an environment that is male dominated, and some people may think you can't be too emotional about this, you got to take it on the chin and move on?
So I suppose, I am like that. I do take it on the chin and move on. But I would say, and I'm not sure if I even understand your question perfectly, but I would say that probably there's not a lot of room for sensitivity and emotions, when you're in a banking environment. That said, I do find I get met with them sometimes. Sometimes people can get emotional about things or upset, and it can be difficult for me if, they're trying to pursue a certain path with perhaps their work, and they feel that my work is not fitting into it, even though, it's just the economics. You can't do much to change what it is. So I suppose you just sometimes have to learn to deal with it, to just roll with it and get on and carry on with your work. It's luckily a diverse role. So I deal with a lot of different people all the time. I deal with a lot of different meetings, a lot of different requirements. Sometimes if you're having a difficulty with one person in an area, you can debate it, you can mediate, but it's unfortunately part of the territory that it's not always going to be an easy environment. And of course, sometimes you do get people who can behave in a difficult fashion. And I think, the longer you're in the business world, the longer you learn to desensitize, the longer you learn to cope with it. But sometimes I think you're quite right. It can be an unpleasant event if it does happen. Of course, that's not necessarily anything to do with investing. It could happen, externally as well, perhaps in a very difficult TV interview or something like that. But you just do need to learn to try and carry on and work your way around it.
Your first TV interview, do you remember it? Your first sort of public interview. It doesn't have to be TV, it could also be radio, but do you remember the time?
I actually remember as they came to Investec, they wanted a TV interview. I think it was Business Day TV in those days. Well, I'm not exactly sure. I think they came to Investec, they had all the recording equipment. I was sitting in a meeting room, and it wasn't that difficult, because I suppose I was in my environment and I was talking about a subject to my knowledge. So perhaps that's why I don't find TV interviews difficult, because I'm talking to experience and I'm also talking on a fairly straightforward topic. I think, if you have a more difficult type of interview, perhaps if you're talking about a very sensitive topic, or you're talking about a topic which, the interviewer is trying to needle you on for something that's to create a sensationalist interview, then of course that then turns into a more difficult situation.
When you look at the industry overall, since you started, in your opinion, how has it changed in terms of gender diversity, or even conversations around equal pay and remuneration? What are you hearing, even from colleagues and friends who are in the industry? How far have we come?
I'd say in the economics world, there has been a big increase in diversity, certainly from, when I came to Joburg in the early 2000s, the very late 90s. And I, started off then compared to now. There's much more diversity in the economics field. There's much more diversity across economists, genders. I don't think necessarily would play a big role in pay anymore. But of course, for those that perhaps may find it does, then obviously they need to take it up with their employers. But I think, that is something which has decreased in terms of perhaps what it was like several years ago.
Yeah. What happens after Chief Economist? Is there another layer to the overall sort of job category of Chief Economist? Have you thought about that? What do other people do beyond being a Chief Economist?
I'm not too sure, but I was on TV the other day with an executive chief economist. Perhaps he's leveraged up a level there.
Probably. I guess you joined the board, maybe. And you do. I can't describe what that could be, but I'm assuming that's the next level. I don't know.
Possibly, but I really enjoy, analysis, research writing, looking at data, and obviously, drawing information out of it, forecasting. So for me, that's a very integral part of my role. I don't think I necessarily would want to be a board member just for the sake of being a board member. You know what I'm trying to say? So it's certainly not my goal to get on the Investec board. If you were to personalize that into my current situation, I think rather, it would depend on how would my job change, how would my day change, and would that be something I would prefer to do compared to what I'm doing now? I think, the person I was talking about for yesterday, I think they're in more of an investment role because in a smaller sort of environment. So I think that's quite a big difference. In other words, they're not at a bank.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. So from an asset management environment, I think it's a bit of a different role. You still do a lot of economics, and of course, we can see with the current environment globally why macroeconomics are so very important if we look at the effect it's having on financial markets. So I think, one needs to bear in mind there are different types of economic roles as well, not necessarily just an economist in a bank.
When you mentioned forecasting, the first word that came to my mind is numbers. And I can imagine as a university student probably watching this, you might have to have a fairly good relationship with numbers if being an economist is going to be the career you're going with. Am I correct?
I think so. I think you need to have quite a strong love of numbers. If you don't like maths, if you don't like statistics, and if you're not planning on doing econometrics, you might find it a bit difficult.
Yeah. In an environment like this, globally, where it's so chaotic, I don't even know what to read anymore, because sometimes good news is bad news and bad news is bad news. So it's a bit of a upside down world. like how are you viewing the current world right now? Like, I mean, is it what's stressing you? What's worrying you as an economist? And also, if you for a second take your economist hat off and you go into your own sort of life with family and friends, what's concerning you about the world right now?
Many things, including climate change, but certainly right at the moment, we're just looking at the tensions in the Russian-Ukraine environment, the extreme energy crisis that Europe is obviously going through as it moves into its winter period. And of course, the impact that'll have on prices around the world, on energy prices, both for us in South Africa, but of course also on inflation as well. And that in turn will feed through into our interest rate environments. And then, of course, into the risk of global recessions. I think that's very concerning. That's very worrying, because many people have very difficult lives that is, and that just obviously makes it so much worse. It makes it so much more damaging. As an economist, we focus quite heavily on the socioeconomic impacts, the macroeconomic impacts, the political impacts. And I think, of course, as well, as I was saying earlier, climate change also something that worries me because we're not seeing the mitigation that's needed. We're not seeing a rapid move to clean energy. We're certainly not seeing it likely that we're going to meet our net zero emission targets by 2050, which obviously have been detailed as necessary to prevent global warming from exceeding 1.7%. Remember, we're at 1.2% already. So, 1.7% actually is quite an important figure. It means that'll be worse, the effects of physical risk of global warming than we're experiencing now. Of course, we remember the KwaZulu-Natal floods earlier this year, and that was very devastating. Now, what the scientists are saying, because we are not seeing the mitigation coming through in terms of climate change policies, carbon taxes, that we're actually on the road to the 3 to 4% or hothouse world. And of course, that's very damaging for the global economy, yes, but more importantly for people, for crop farming, for animals, agricultural farming, yes, but also, of course, livestock, and all of those factors, would make the planet very dangerous to live in certain areas. I think people don't realize that there'll be some parts of the world where it'll become unlivable, where you won't be able to farm. And in fact, we've even been seeing with the deglobalization that's been coming through because of the Russian-Ukraine war, and of course the limit on fertilizer production. The reason why we are able to feed the global population essentially, and you can see there's been a lot of reports from the United Nations on, food security, hunger in Africa, all of those vital concerns, is because obviously there has been increase in food production globally because of fertilizer usage. And if we start to cut that out or reduce it, it has severe effects in terms of, crop production and how that's going to affect humans. And of course, the deglobalization, which is underway because of the aggression that we're seeing with the with the Russia-Chinese bloc, and some of the other countries around the world, is obviously quite a risky environment as well. If it persists, it of course worsens.
So there are two reasons why I asked you the question, and I'm going to get to the first one. So when I look at the first one and you look back at your experience since you started off as an economist, I mean, do you find that it's crazier now, like the world is crazier now given the geopolitical tensions, given also some of the market volatility, or is it similar themes that just happen to happen every few years? We go through the same gyrations with risk and market panic, or is it crazier now, for lack of a better description?
I certainly feel that we have had an increased frequency of shocks recently. And of course, that really talks to, as you said, it being crazier now. I think people miss the fact as well that, since the 1980s, we've obviously seen inflation come down massively because of globalization. And now we're having this deglobalization effect that's also pushing up inflation along with the other factors I mentioned in your earlier question. The last time we had a global financial crisis was in 2008-09. And then, of course, we had the pandemic in 2020, which gave us another global recession. But of course, now we are staring at risk of another global recession quite quickly after 2020 because of the substantially higher interest rates, but also, of course, the effects of high inflation, reduction in real incomes, of the suppressing effect on consumer and business sentiment. All of those factors are creating quite a negative environment. You're talking about the huge volatility of financial market indicators. Of course, that is in there as well. So we are certainly finding ourselves in a difficult period.
So now I'm going to get to the second part of asking that question. So I'm sure you're familiar with the likes of David Shapiro, etc. And one of the funny things he shared is that he finds himself sometimes when he's out and about doing his daily life that people still want to ask him about stock recommendations and share prices, etc. Do you find that even outside of the work environment, people still want to talk shop with you or ask you how you're looking at the world, etc.?
Yes, absolutely. And it can be a bit disconcerting if you're at a children's birthday party or if you just popped into the shop to buy some fruit and vegetables. So absolutely, it does happen.
So, I mean, it sounds like such a cliche question when people ask this, but if you had to look back at your younger self and give her advice, given everything you know and you've learned so far about yourself, what would you say to her?
Possibly just that she's doing much better than she thinks she is. She can have confidence in herself and she doesn't need to worry.
Yeah. Okay, that's very interesting because I mean, it's fascinating how over the past few episodes, so many women have shared quite interesting things. And I said to them, the one thing I would tell my younger self would be to take more risks. I think I was very sort of guarded in my career moves and options, and I was too scared to fail. And now when I look back and I sort of want to kick myself and say, oh, I wish I'd taken that risk because it actually would have turned out fine and I would have learned along the way. So it's quite interesting for you to share that.
I think some of the risks, well, bearing in mind that I've worked at Investec for a very long time, since 2001, so it's over 20 years, some of the difficulties that I faced obviously were internal issues. And I think, accepting some of the requirements to do certain roles of work, whether it was regulatory requirements and, a huge amount of work for the IFRS and capital requirements, just some of the regulatory requirements of the banks, it did actually shut me off from some other opportunities and avenues that were open to me at the time. And when I look back now, you can certainly have some regret. You might have preferred to go in a different way. And certainly, my choice was to support the bank as much as I could by fitting in and delivering on these regulatory requirements because it just was needed to keep the bank operating. But it hasn't necessarily placed me in the ideal position now that I could have been in when I, from some other client-facing roles that perhaps I lost out on opportunities back then because obviously I was very heavily focused on this absolutely overwhelmingly enormous requirement that was coming in for all the banks at the time, in 2016.
Before I let you go, Annabel, if a piece of advice that you have for a young person who's watching this interview and who's seen you many times on TV and who's also heard of you on various radio platforms, what would you say to them?
I would certainly say try lots of different things. I would say don't necessarily think you have to become an economist or you have to become a computer programmer or just stick to something. There's many different nuances in those careers. And of course, they do link up with other careers. We have people who perhaps qualified as engineers at university and then came to Investec to work as research analysts in the mining sector, for example, and then would move on to some other role in the bank. So again, we also had people who've come in as a medical doctor, but then they've actually gone into capital markets and they've turned into traders and worked on interest rate desks. So I think don't limit yourself. Even if you do qualify in a certain type of degree, there's space to move around and move into other areas if you wish.
Well, thank you so much for making time to chat to us. And I do believe that the audience has learned a little bit more about you. That is Annabel Bishop, who is the Chief Economist at Investec. And I can't wait to share the next episode. However, thank you so much for tuning and watching.